Hello, and welcome to Mountain Views. I'm Dan Agatino, your host. Joining us in studio today is Pastor Edwards. Pastor, thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Today you were talking to us about the Magi. You were telling us something that I found fascinating. That the decision, your reading of this story, the decision that they made came from a deeper place than just, let's weigh the pros and the cons. It wasn't for them, well, let's decide how long is the journey, how much will it cost us, what are we going to get when we get there, how long will it take to get back. It was a whole different way of thinking.
Yeah, and the point being, when I thought about that, realizing that when you're talking about really changing the direction of your life, trying to live in a new way, that kind of thinking doesn't work. It works maybe in a lot of practical events of our lives, but if you're deeply considering in a spiritual sense, what direction do I need to move in life to be faithful to God, it's going to come from a deeper place than simply weighing the pros and cons. And I think that those Magi would not have been able to explain their actions to their contemporaries. Why are you going off on this thing that makes no sense when it'd be so much easier to stay here and do what you've done? How did they find the capacity to do that? And that's just sort of got my thought processes going with that. And also countless experiences of making resolutions that I didn't keep about trying to improve the way I live, and realizing in retrospect that it wasn't coming from a deep enough place to really get me up, able to carry through a significant change of course.
So let's talk for a minute about ways to access that deeper place.
It's interesting, I find what the scientists are looking at in terms of the study of the brain is, yeah, the left brain is all about language, which is creating an order on this sort of chaos of our perceptions. And it's useful and it's necessary that we have language, and yet language at the same time kind of blocks us from seeing life from another angle, and that God is always inviting us to see life from another angle, and which is what it's interesting that I think that the right brain is part of how God, the hardwire of how God communicates to us, and what does it involve accessing that, which
But what does it involve accessing that, in the sense of, okay, we have the story of the wise men, the Magi, but bringing that into our lives, what does it take to access the deep thoughts to...
Well, one thing I would get at is, when I look at the church today, oftentimes one of the things that plagues us is a sense of tedium, of boredom, and perhaps a lack of passion or lack of the Spirit. And so to ask, just simply to ask, where do we get excited? And to take time, and so you can't just jump into this usually, you have to sort of think, but where does my passion and excitement get me going? Because too often the church is filled with, well, this is what we should be doing, this is what we always have done, let's just keep doing it because it's safe, it's predictable. But to ask ourselves, well, what if I gave myself permission, could I get really excited about doing? What would get me, and to consciously silence those voices that will constantly say, but that's impractical, but the risks involved. But to give yourself, it's like a brainstorming process where you give yourself permission to be playful with the possibilities, and not just to rule everything out of hand because, it's impractical.
You used a word in this narrative you just shared about boredom, tedium. My understanding is that in all the ancient languages, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Chinese, whatever you pick, there's no word for boredom. It's a modern concept.
Right.
That
probably traced back to the age of Enlightenment, probably too. Yeah.
Well, does that mean that we used to have greater access to these deeper places?
I assume so. Yeah, and it's interesting. God created us with two hemispheres of a brain, and they both are blessings. And for the last couple hundred years, there's been a dominance of using the blessing of our left brain, and wonderful things have come out of it. All of scientific exploration, it can be traced to that kind of dominance. But there's another hemisphere that God gave us, and that has a purpose. And I think when people are tuned into that side, they're not bored. I mean, that's where the whole, all that you go and read that Acts 2 and the language of the prophecy of Joel talking about the Holy Spirit, and it's all kind of right brain stuff, visions and dreams, and to be able to access that when it comes to trying to chart our way forward, because I do think tedium and boredom are doing us in as a church and as individuals in our lives. We were not meant by our beloved God, our Heavenly Father, to live lives of quiet desperation, to use Thoreau's term. I mean, and too often perhaps we're just doing what's familiar rather than paying attention to the gifts and the dreams that God has given us.
So what do we need to do to get to that? Do you need time? For example, if somebody's got a busy schedule, get up, take care of the kids, go to work, come home, get, it's bath time, it's time to make dinner, you got to clean up after everybody.
If you don't set time apart for this process to happen, you're going to have a hard time accessing it. Though even in a busy schedule, if you've had time to sort of say, well, I want to pay attention to this realm, to this idea of new possibilities, then as you go about your busy life, you may have things catching your attention that otherwise wouldn't. I mean, go back to the story of Moses in the wilderness, and something about him allows him to be open to pay attention to this thing that's off of his to-do list, the burning bush. If we've given ourselves opportunity to be attentive to these things, then in the course of our days, to be asking ourselves, now, where in the course of my day did I find myself getting excited, getting enthusiasm? I mean, that's part of what we're dealing with here. What is it that captivates us? And I don't think too often we've been given the permission to go there. It was more, well, I got to do my duty. And of course we have to do our duty, but I believe that there's a connection between the gifts that God gives us and the passions that God has planted within us and the needs of this world, and it's defined how they come together.
How do you personally do this? Or do you personally do this, maybe in preparing this particular sermon? Is it something that...
Well, I mean, that's, for me, the perpetual process of writing a sermon. It is that, to enter into that state of, okay, I have heard this passage 1,000 times before, and that's the challenge, is to hear simply what I've always heard, but to be in a state of openness where I perhaps hear something altogether new. And for me, in the pastor's study, so to speak, it is the question of, well, what catches my attention and evokes a passion within me in relationship to this passage? Because if I don't feel some passion about it, I'm not going to be able to convey any passion. So it is that asking that question, well, if I can lay aside everything I've always thought about this passage, what's surprising about it? What's captivating about it? What's making me want to get up and follow, like the wise men?
There's nobody who doesn't have a deep longing.
Yes, and it's connected to our giftedness, which is unique in everybody. And but it is also that belief that as we are all differently gifted, we are all part of the body, and there is a place for each of our gifts to be accessed for the betterment of the body, of the whole.
That makes sense, that we should be plugged into what we love. But the alternative, what you're saying, if I'm understanding correctly, is we ought to avoid autopilot, of just going through this rote monotony of this is the way life is. Quiet desperation, to use the term that you threw out.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a comfort in autopilot.
Sure.
There's an easiness in autopilot.
Right.
There's a safeness, isn't there?
There absolutely is. And it's important to acknowledge that. I mean, I have consciously chosen this. But if I find myself haunted by a sense of well, this may be safe, but I am as bored as can be. This may be safe, but I'm having a hard time getting out of bed or getting out the door. I'm having a hard time approaching my life with any passion and enthusiasm. Then we need to weigh what we've sacrificed by taking the safe path. And those Magi, I'm captivated by the image of them in middle age, choosing to undergo this adventure, which wasn't easy, but it was exciting.
When you talk about the Magi's excitement, do you think it was an epiphany for them immediately?
Part of what caught me is the motivation in these Magi, and how often we, all of us, even those of us who are faithful Christians, can come to a place in our life of tedium, of boredom, of going through the motions, of not really embracing our life as a gift from God that we passionately come to as an adventure that God has invited us on.
What about the possibility that there are those who have gone through the process you're talking about? They know they have a deep longing, but they're fearful of, if I fulfill this longing, then that's it. In the sense of, I have achieved my goals, and it's like Alexander, he wept because there were no more empires to conquer.
Yeah, that could well be. I'm involved in theater over the years in the church, and the first time I was ever in that whole adventure of being in a play and that whole exciting process, after it was over, it was a sad and scary feeling of emptiness. So that could well be. If I go let myself do what I've always dreamed of, what then? What then? But our God is a gracious God, an abundant God, and should you succeed in that set for dream, if you've still got life left in you, God's got other dreams for you to live out too. So fear not. They're waiting for us.
Here we are on the cusp of a brand new year, and according to some reckonings, depending on how you do the calculations, a whole new decade. So your message is one of hope, one of playfulness in a way, and it's a message of granting permission, God granting us permission to be who He called us to be, and that may involve difference. It may involve the disapproval of others.
Yeah, and being misunderstood by others, for sure, because I don't think those Magi could explain what they did to their peers.
We have to stay true to what we're called to, though, regardless.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and the possibilities are there. And each of us has to ask that question. I mean, what would it mean for me to be faithful like the Magi in my little corner of the universe where God's placed me?
In closing, just curious to know if in your journey and the work that you do as a minister of Jesus, do you find that there are many people who embrace this challenge, or do you see it as...
Well, there are many that embrace this challenge, but I think too often we get that, you know, that there is in the story of the prodigal son, he comes back and he discovers what it is to be his father's child. Let me live in your house as a paid servant, as opposed to live in your house as a son. And I think too often we fall back into living in the house as a paid servant. You know, the dutiful, do my duty, try to fulfill my oughts as best I can. But we are sons and daughters of a great and glorious King who wants more for us than that.
Thank you so much for your message and for reminding us of our heritage.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into Mountain Views. I'm Dan Agatino, your host.